morning. My name is John Lapp. I'm a member of Mennonite Mission Network's leadership team and acting director for Asia and Middle East. Welcome to another Hope Around the World partner interview. Today we also welcome to our virtual studios the Executive Director of Mennonite Partners in China, Dr. Myrrl Byler. Thank you for joining me, Myrrl, to share some insights into the world of China and how Mennonites have been connected there. Myrrl, maybe you could begin by telling us something of your background, what drew you to international ministry, and specifically to China, and what have you been doing for the past 30 years or so that you've been involved in China?
Well, thanks, John, for inviting me to be a part of this. As one gets older, there's a lot more history to look back on as to involvement in the church and in mission. Going way back, I actually grew up. I grew up in the Amish church and Beachy Amish church, and so I have a bit of a different background, but one that I dearly cherish. After education and some teaching time, my wife and I spent some years in Germany, West Berlin back in those days, involved in an inner city church ministry. And it was during that time that I became interested. I was an English teacher and was doing a lot of tutoring, and I became quite interested in wanting to further that part of my life. So returned to the U.S. and did some further studies in teaching English as a second language, and began to look to see where should we go. And we're pointed in a lot of different directions, but for whatever reason, at least back in the mid 1980s, China was the place that stood out to me, and that I really felt attracted and called to. It's not that I knew a lot about China. Actually, I knew almost nothing. Our history classes and so on, you just didn't spend much time with Asia. Everything was very Western focused. And so I really knew very, very little. But it was attractive because there was a program there, China Educational Exchange. They were sending teachers, and I was a teacher. And also, I think the other reason we had looked at Japan and a few other places, but we wanted to go to a developing country, which China very much was at that time, and so that's why we made the decision to go there. I think the other part of it is that it was probably the inner city mission church experience was a wonderful. Was a wonderful and learning time for us, but it was also a bit draining. And so I was looking forward to getting back into the classroom again and using the classroom as a vehicle to share my faith, and to especially with students who have no background at all in terms of faith. And so that's how it started. Went to China in 1987 and taught there for a few years. And then in 1989 was asked if I wanted to become involved in more the administration of China Educational Exchange, as it was called at that time. And so I began the job that I have presently in 1990. So it's been 30 years now of working in China and with Chinese people and with North Americans. Mennonite agencies, Mennonite colleges working in China. So that's the brief summary.
Thanks. Mennonite Partners in China for years and still does focus pretty much on English language teaching in China and exchange with Chinese teachers that come here. But in some ways, you have become more connected with the church in China. Can you tell us something about the church in China so that we can sort of understand that part of the lay of the land?
Well, that's a large topic, obviously. As for Mennonites in our involvement, It's primarily from the very beginning has been with what we call the Three Self Church or the registered churches in China. Um, from from about 1966 to 1978, almost 1980. It was a period of time in China called the Cultural Revolution, and it was a time of great chaos, a lot of violence, and one of the things that happened during the Cultural Revolution was the attempt to completely eradicate religion from China. And so during that time, all churches, temples, mosques, everything was shut down, was closed. It became criminal to worship openly in any way. Having a Bible was also criminal. And so at that point, the church really had to go completely and totally underground. There was a lot of fear that the church would be lost during that time, that it would simply disappear. But in looking back, we know that that was not the case. In fact, the church probably grew during that period of time of intense persecution and suffering, with so many believers, so many pastors being sent to prison, being sent to labor camps. So it was a very, very difficult time. When China began to reopen again, then in the late 1970s, by 1980, they began to rehabilitate a lot of these pastors, a lot of the religious leaders, and so the church opened up again in 1980, and it was a very slow process. And for the initial years during the 1980s, churches were still somewhat small. People were quite cautious. The vast majority of people were quite elderly. The vast number of people who attended church were elderly women. And so during that time then, China Educational Exchange Mennonites began to relate to this, the open church, or what we call the registered church, that was officially recognized by the government. And throughout the years, we've continued this association. Today, now, nearly 40 years later, there are more than 60,000 churches in China, and that doesn't include lots of small meeting points that are attached to these churches, and probably as many as 30, perhaps 35 million believers who attend these open churches. So the growth has been quite phenomenal within the Three Self Church. The Three Self Church, is what we call post-denominational. So people sometimes ask, well, are there Mennonite churches in China that you relate to? And at this point, no, there are not. We have been in touch primarily and partnered with a lot of the pastors and leaders and seminaries that are a part of these open churches. One of the reasons is that we're foreigners. We stick out when we visit China. And to be associated with house church groups, those that are meeting more secretly, can be a problem for not only for us, but especially for them. And so we've tended to want to try to support the Three Self Church in whatever way that we can throughout the years. The other part of the church that people always want to know about as well, we sometimes call the house churches or meeting points, or maybe more accurately, the unregistered church, those who are not registered with the government. So technically they are illegal. However, if they avoid overt contact with the outside world, especially with the West, and if they keep their meetings somewhat small and don't create disturbances, and if they have decent relationship with local officials, then often they are allowed to continue meeting. At times, though, they will face censure by the government. There are occasions, certainly, when people are arrested. Usually, it's when they become too vocal, either political, or they become too involved with Western organizations. So those are kind of the two streams of the church. People often want to know about size. Some people say, well, the house church The unregistered church is much, much larger than the registered church. It's difficult to say, but certainly there may be as many as 60, 70 million believers in China today, Protestants. It's very, very possible.
We read mostly about political issues related to the U.S. and China. That's what's in the news. But I suppose that some of these larger issues affect the church going forward as well. Can you say what are some of the things that are happening in the church and how they relate to the national matters that we hear about?
Sure. Yeah, and I'll just kind of talk about some of the things that I read, but also the people that I talk to. For the last year, I've been working with something called the China Christian Daily, which is a website which prints news on the church in China. These are all journalists in China, mostly young Christians, and they have a website, several Chinese websites, but also an English website, ChinaChristianDaily.org. And so I do a lot of proofreading of the articles which they do in English. I'd say for the last 4 or 5 months, obviously the topic has been the pandemic and the church's response to this. And so I've learned a lot about the churches and what they're struggling with during this time. Most of the churches were shut down already by the end of February as public gatherings, and then they shifted to online, just as we have here. For a lot of the churches, especially those in urban settings and with a more educated populace, that hasn't been a problem. They've been able to make that switch to online. But for rural congregations and congregations with more elderly people, it's been very difficult for them to access. There are other problems. Certainly, financial is an issue. Giving is a problem when you're not able to meet together. And then there's a lot of the pastors complain about people doing church shopping. Going from one site to the next site of different churches, and then choosing the one that has the glitziest or the most impressive online presence, and just kind of attending there. And so there's a lot of concern about that. However, in the last 6 weeks now, churches have started to meet again. China has their COVID problem under control and has had for several months. And so they're meeting again. However, they're limited. When you enter a church, you have to have your temperature taken. You have to have the health code on your phone be green, which means that you haven't been in any affected areas in the recent past. And then you also actually have to register to go to church, and then they show you to your seat. So there's a lot of social distancing. So what the churches have had to do is they've had to add services because there, literally hundreds and in many cases thousands of people wanting to go to church. So they've had to add services to try to accommodate people. But yeah, so people are back in church again. Some of the other gatherings aren't permitted yet, but that's happening. One of the other things that they have complained a lot about, and it's always an issue, are heresies and cults, and they've been particularly strong during this period of time. There's a cult that you may have read about that started in South Korea, the Shincheonji cult, kind of translated New Heaven and Earth, and they've been very influential in China. And they have the most expensive and the best online presence. So when you go to their sites and you look at their church services, they're very professionally done because they're mainly coming from South Korea, and so that has attracted a lot. It's a very friendly, a very welcoming cult. But once they kind of get their tentacles into you, they are really, really invasive, and They work very, very fast with people. So that's been a big, big concern for the churches. Government is always an issue, and their heavy-handedness, and that I would just say that in my years in China, 30 plus years in China, the restrictions by the government are stronger now than they have been during the past couple of years. They're stronger than they have been at any other time that I've observed and seen China. This is particularly true for the Three Self Church. For example, anyone under the age of 18 is no longer permitted to be a part of any type of church service, any type of religious service. It's whether it's Buddhist, Tibetan Buddhist, or Muslim or whatever. Religious education under the age of 18 is not permitted. So that's been a big adjustment for a lot of churches who have had very active Sunday school and youth programs. But they're usually quite inventive, and so they simply take them off-site. And they find other places and other ways to do camps. And they don't call them anything, nothing to do with religion. They call them other kinds of, give them other names. But the effect is pretty much the same. But that's been a very difficult one. There's a lot of pressure on teachers and educators to not attend church, and they get pressure from their superiors. Another big movement the past couple of years has been to pull down crosses off of the top of church buildings. The Chinese believers, especially the ones in rural areas, they love a big red bright cross and then put it up as absolutely high above their church building as possible. And they do it as a means of witness and telling people that, hey, here's a church. That has drawn the ire of the government, and so in several provinces they have begun forcing the church to pull those down, and if they don't, they come in and take them down. They're still permitted to have the cross, but that needs to be on the side of the church building or in a much less prominent place. It's also happening within Islam as well, that they're forcing mosques to do much the same as far as their visibility. So there are a number of things that are happening now which are troublesome. I would say for the house churches, it's less invasive, and partly because they're already illegal and they are already much more secretive, much more hidden. It's much harder to attack them than it is the Three Self. I should also mention that the Three Self is one of the things that is happening for their leadership is the government is asking pastors and church leaders. They go for training classes up to a week to 2 weeks in length that the government arranges for them. And in these training classes, they are taught Chinese history and Chinese culture, and they're told how the church needs to I guess you could say how the church needs to be subject to the government and what they need to do. And the focus is what they call, and they use this big long word in English, it's called the sinicization of Christianity, which simply means contextualizing, making the church more Chinese, getting rid of Western elements of the church. So now flags are more prominently displayed in churches. There have been places where at certain meetings where they play the national anthem before the beginning of the church service. And so it's creating a lot of pressure for leaders who are, if they want to keep their churches open, they need to do these things, even though they are quite unhappy with this. And then there's also trying to go into Chinese culture and finding things within Chinese culture that they can relate to Christianity rather than always borrowing from the West. So, for instance, just this past week, I was editing several articles about Chinese tea culture and was giving some of the history of the Chinese tea ceremony and Chinese tea culture, and then relating some of the virtues that are contained in there to being Christian. And they talked about purity, they talked about cleanliness, servanthood, humility, all of those things that are involved in Chinese tea culture, and then relating them to our lives as Christians. So that's just one little example of the kind of thing which they're being pushed to do, which I think in many ways it's a good thing, but it also has another side to it as well. Well, there are a lot of other things that I could talk about, certainly, but that's just a bit of an overview of what's happening now. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thanks very much for those insights. That you touch on sort of the direction of things, but is there anything to say about future direction? And particularly, has the church, at least in some micro locations, been interested in Anabaptist thinking, and how might that affect at least those churches' ways of responding to the direction that things are going in China?
Right. Yeah, this has been actually within the last 2 years a rather unexpected development for us, because, as I mentioned, up to this time, we've primarily related to pastors within registered churches. But now more recently, we've been receiving more requests from house church groups, from very small, urban, well-educated groups who are interested in asking about Anabaptists, and more specifically about Mennonites. And as we share just very, very basic ideas about our theology and our practice, it is attracting attention. In fact, right now, even as I speak, we have a couple of young Chinese pastors, one of them who has been working with us for a number of years, a graduate of AMBS in Elkhart. He is on the road visiting a number of these very small house churches. And these are 8 to 10 to 12 people. They really can't get larger than that. It causes problems. And sharing some materials with them, talking with them, building relationships, and they're really quite interested. Within the house churches, a lot of the house churches have been very strongly influenced by Western denominations, and this has been going on for a lot of years. And some of these people some of these house church leaders are becoming a bit disillusioned with what they're hearing from the West, particularly as Westerners, and I would also say South Koreans, present a very strongly political kind of gospel to them, focused on building another Christendom in China, focused on saying, the real goal is actually to build a Christian culture within China, to overthrow the Communist Party, to make China Christian. And some of these people that we've been talking to us, they're very uncomfortable with this direction. They feel manipulated, they feel used, and they feel that this is not true to the Chinese context. They're like, we're Chinese, we live here, we're not trying to overthrow our government. We appreciate what the government is doing for us in many ways, and we simply want to follow Jesus. We want to know, what does that really mean? Aside from all the political baggage that other people are trying to push our way. And I'd say the other thing which is very interesting for them is they're very tired of top-down leadership. Many of these house churches are run by extremely strong, dictatorial, I suppose you could call it, leaders. And they've grown very tired of that. They're tired. These people are all educated. They have college educations. They don't want people telling them what to do anymore, and to do so in a very preachy way. And so the idea of lay leadership is very, very attractive to them. The idea of leading together within a group is attractive for them. Humility and servanthood, those ideas of leadership, which really is not present within the Chinese church, whether it's registered or unregistered, and especially for those who are influenced by by pastors from South Korea, where it's still a really top-down kind of model. And so the Anabaptists, when we come along and we talk about servant leadership, that is striking a real chord with some of these people. So what we're trying to do now is do translation of some Anabaptist materials, continuing that, and then putting a lot of stuff online and trying to build relationships. And this is not a lot us Westerners doing this. These are our Chinese brothers and sisters who are committed Anabaptists who are interested in spreading this. And so we're working towards perhaps a small network of fellowships, house church fellowships in China that may want to relate in some way to the larger Anabaptist community in the future. But it's still fledgling. It's still growing, and will take a lot of attention and a lot of work and a lot of prayer. Certainly, very much need and appreciate that.
Myrrl, thank you very much for being with us today. It's really eye-opening to hear these stories about what life in China is like, and particularly life of the church and the people that are not just facing what they feel they should be doing, but what they are also being steered toward in some ways. Thank you, and I hope that we can talk to you again.
Thank you.